June 7th, 1692. Before this date, Port Royal was the richest English city in the Americas. Not Boston, not New York. A tiny spit of sand in Jamaica that somehow crammed 6,000 souls into barely 53 acres. For perspective, that's denser than modern Manhattan. They called it the Sodom of the New World. They called it the London of the Caribbean. Both names were accurate. Here's what the historical record tells us. At 11:43 a.m. on that June morning, 2/3 of this city simply vanished. Not burned, not bombed. It sank. Swallowed whole by the earth itself. The problem with studying Port Royal is that engravings lie. They flatten. They simplify. They can't capture what it felt like to stand on Thames Street when the taverns opened, when the auction houses roared to life, when Spanish gold changed hands faster than you could count it. So I did something different. I took every surviving map, every archaeological survey, every eyewitness account from that day, and I fed them into an AI reconstruction system. What you're about to see is Port Royal at 11:30 a.m. 13 minutes before the world ended. Let me walk you through the city that shouldn't have existed in the first place. If we start at the harbor entrance and move inland, the first thing that hits you is the sound. The hammer of ship carpenters, the screech of unloading cargo, but mostly coins. The endless ring of silver reals and gold doubloons changing hands. Port Royal in 1692 processed more wealth per square foot than anywhere else in the New World. Now look up. This is what shocks me every time I study this reconstruction. 4-story brick buildings. The kind you'd see in London or Amsterdam. Except London was built on clay and bedrock. Port Royal was built on sand. Loose, water-saturated sand. The English imported the bricks as ship ballast, 20,000 bricks per building, some of them. They built UP because they couldn't build out. The entire city was crammed onto a narrow peninsula, so they just kept stacking floors. If we turn this corner onto High Street, you'd brush shoulders with a former pirate spending his retirement drinking Madeira wine in the shade, a Dutch merchant haggling over turtle shells, an enslaved African hauling water from the communal well, because yes, despite all that ocean, fresh water was scarce. A tavern keeper watering down the rum. A pickpocket sizing up his next mark. This place smelled like money and rot in equal measure. Silk hanging in shop windows, raw sewage in the streets. The stench of turtle slaughterhouses mixing with perfume from the merchants' wives. Everything here was a contradiction. And the heat. My God, the heat. It's early June, Caribbean summer is beginning. The air is thick, oppressive. The kind of morning where you sweat just standing still. Later, survivors would describe the atmosphere before the earthquake as unusually close and sultry. The calm before annihilation. If we follow the shoreline east, we reach Fort Charles. This is the only part of Port Royal that will survive today. Massive coral stone walls, 50 cannons pointing at any Spanish ship foolish enough to approach. This fort wasn't just military defense, it was a statement. Britain owns these waters. From up here on the ramparts, you get the full view. The harbor packed with merchant vessels and former pirate ships, gone legitimate. The warehouses groaning with sugar, indigo, logwood. And stretching before us, the heart of the city. Let me take you there. Thames Street, the main artery, 4 taverns per block. I'm not exaggerating, that's from the tax records. The Flying Horse, the Feathers, the Sign of the Mermaid, the Jamaican Dog, every one of them packed by noon. Here's what you need to understand. Port Royal wasn't just wealthy, it was liquid wealthy. Cash economy. A privateer could capture a Spanish merchant vessel on Monday, sell the cargo in Port Royal on Wednesday, and drink himself to death by Saturday. And they did, frequently. The mortality rate here was catastrophic even before the earthquake. Yellow fever, malaria, alcohol poisoning, violence. But no one cared. because you could get rich in 6 months, if you survived. Moving through the merchant district, past the auction houses where enslaved people were sold alongside hogsheads of sugar, past the counting houses where Spanish treasure became English capital. Everyone here knew Port Royal existed on borrowed time. Pirates don't build for the future. Neither did this city. But no one expected the loan to be called in so suddenly. 3 minutes before noon, the first tremor, then the second, stronger, then the third, and the earth began to liquefy. This is what the scientific term liquefaction cannot capture. The sand beneath Port Royal was saturated with water. When the earthquake hit, the shaking turned solid ground into a liquid. But not water, something worse. Quicksand. The ground rippled like waves. Buildings didn't collapse. They sank, straight down. The brick structures I showed you, whole 4-story houses dropping into the earth like stones into water. Eyewitness testimonies describe people sinking to their waists, then the sand solidifying around them. Trapped, unable to move. Some were still alive when the tsunami came. The wave. When that much land suddenly drops into the sea, the ocean rushes in to fill the void. A wall of water smashed through Thames Street, through the merchant district, swallowing everything that hadn't already sunk. The church, gone. The graveyard, gone. Coffins floating in the harbor. The warehouses with their mountains of gold, gone. 2,000 people died in 2 minutes. For the religious survivors, this wasn't geology. This was God's judgment. The Sodom comparison suddenly felt less like moral panic and more like prophecy. By noon, 2/3 of Port Royal was underwater. In the 1960s, archaeologists diving the site found a pocket watch, still ticking forward in its owner's imagination, frozen forever at 11:43, a timestamp for the moment an entire city stopped existing. This is Port Royal today, a time capsule under 20 feet of water. The buildings are still there, or what's left of them. Brick foundations, ceramic rum bottles, clay pipes, pieces of 8 scattered in the sand. Where sharks now patrol, the richest bank in the Caribbean once counted its gold. Where I just showed you Thames Street bustling with tavern goers, now there's only coral and silence. The city that stopped mid-sentence. Every artifact they pull up is a frozen moment. A woman's comb, a child's toy, someone's last meal still in the pot. Port Royal didn't fade, it didn't decline, it vanished. And because it vanished so completely, it's preserved better than almost any other 17th century city. A tragedy became an archaeological gift. Here's what Port Royal teaches us. Civilization is rented, not owned. The lease can be canceled without warning. We build on unstable foundations, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, and we convince ourselves that momentum equals permanence. Port Royal was the richest English city in the Americas. It took 120 seconds to erase it. How many of our cities exist on similar borrowed time? How many are built on earthquake faults, in flood zones, on coasts with rising seas? When I walk through this AI reconstruction, I'm walking through 6,000 lives that thought they had tomorrow. They didn't. None of us do. What other lost city should I reconstruct? Drop a comment below.